I'm Keltie Maguire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Kids Are Childfree Podcast. Today marks the wrap up of season 3 of the podcast, and we're going to do something a little bit different than we've done the last 2 season wrap ups, where I had previously shared some of my top takeaways from the previous season's episodes. Curious how you like this little change in format. Of course, always welcoming your feedback, but I'd love to hear from you in my DMs to see what you thought about this relative to me sharing top takeaways and some clips from previous episodes. Always like to keep it fresh and play around with new things. So looking forward to seeing and hearing what you think. So today what we're going to do for our season 3 wrap up is I thought I would give you a little peek behind the curtain, so to speak, and let you in on some of the topics and questions and themes that we've been exploring inside both my group coaching program, the Kids Are Child-Free group coaching program, as well as in some of my private coaching sessions recently. I will be referring you to certain podcasts and guests that we heard from in this last season that sort of tackle and address and speak to some of the themes that we're going to be talking about. So I think I have 4 different sort of key topics that I want to address. Again, thought I'd give you just like a little peek inside at some of the things we talk about when I am helping my clients to explore and process this kids or child-free decision. So one of the things that happens in between our Kids or Child-Free group program coaching calls is we connect in the Slack channel that I have for each program group. And I always like to share resources that relate to what we've been discussing in the actual sessions. And it's also a chance for people to share and process how their decision-making journey is going, and also to share resources and tools that have been helpful for them. And so off the back of one of our early sessions in one of our 2 groups that I'm running right now, one of the women brought an article and shared this idea of what's referred to as alloparenting, which is something you may or may not have heard of. And I'm going to tell you what it is in just a second. But she shared that this is and was an idea that really connected with her. And it's been interesting to see how this notion of alloparenting is one that we have brought into a number of our calls and has really stood out and I guess created more sort of interest and enticement in the child-free path. And again, I'm going to explain why this is in just a second. So effectively what alloparenting is it refers to parenting or caring for a child or children that is done by the non-primary parent or parents. So historically, amongst humans, this has looked like siblings caring for a child or grandparents, but it has been extended to encompass really anybody part of a community that is helping to care for and raise a child. And this is something that actually I believe comes from like the animal kingdom. It's something that often, other animals in a pack or a group will help care for and raise a child. And my client in particular, and this group in general, really likes this concept because it is a way to still experience and enjoy nurturing for and being part of a child's life without necessarily all of those other big commitments and changes that come with having a child or children. And I know this isn't the case for every person who is on the fence, but sometimes it can be really hard to let go of the dream of having children be part of your life, of investing in a child or children's future and well-being, of helping to care for a child. And while I realize that taking on a role as an allo parent in a child or children's lives is not the same thing as having a child, it is a way to sort of tap into and connect with this part of yourself that may be longing for that kind of connection. And what this can look like, and it's not something that necessarily needs to be formalized in any kind of way or spoken out, but it's really about a commitment to say, I want to play a role in a child or, again, various children's lives. And it could be a relative, like a niece or a nephew. It could be a cousin. It could be family, friends, or, friends' kids. But making a commitment to showing up for them, for maybe celebrating certain occasions for them, for having certain rituals, for being a person outside of that primary relationship with parents to, have a positive impact on them and have great shared experiences. Of course, it probably goes without saying that parents would be, most parents anyways, very grateful to have additional support in raising their child. And again, this doesn't have to mean that like you're there all the time, day in and day out, right? This is the benefit of being an alloparent, is you don't necessarily have to partake in all of the hard stuff, but it's an interesting framing, and one that I think goes beyond just this idea of, I'm going to be part of kids' lives and involved with them, but really thinking about yourself in this sort of way or role, if this is something that resonates with you. And again, this is something that's provided a lot of solace, in particular for those women who are really struggling with this idea of giving up parenthood, or where they feel like there's a lot that entices them, and yet there are other reasons that speak against them having a child or children. So check out this idea of alloparenting. I'm going to see if I can find the article that my client had shared with us and share it in the show notes of today's episode. Something I think this idea of alloparenting really brings up is the idea that we so much tend to discount relationships with children that are not our own children. Like, we tend to see them as secondary to, or that somehow they don't count. And this is something you might have heard me talk about in past podcast episodes, is the fact that if you are enjoying or having a beautiful experience with a child that is not your own, whether it's cuddling a newborn baby or having a lot of laughter and playing with a child, it's easy to feel wistful and sad, like, well, but that's not my baby. That's not my child. And I don't want to dismiss if these feelings are present. Of course, like, be in your feels, but we also get to remember that we are still having that experience, and that experience is valid. If we are having enjoyment or pleasure or fun or tenderness with a child that's not our own, it in every way counts. We don't need to feel like, well, it doesn't count because it's not my child. And I try and really relish and bask in the enjoyable moments that I have with kids in my life, and remind myself, these are my experiences. I am having these, and they don't need to be invalidated because this is not my child. Interestingly, I was reminded of this. I was watching a sort of cheesy holiday movie over the weekend, which I'm not big on cheesy holiday movies, but I guess I was feeling kind of cozy. And I watched a movie from about 10 years ago called Love the Coopers. Doesn't get a great score on Rotten Tomatoes or any of those movie rating databases, but I liked it nonetheless. It was kind of quirky. And there's a character in the film who is without kids, no partner, and she's feeling, I want to say understandably, not to say this is the case for everyone, but she's feeling sorry for herself at the holidays because she feels like the outcast. She feels different from her sister, who has this sort of, quote, big happy family. And she realizes, as we have at the end of these holiday films, these sort of life lessons, she realizes that, hey, she does have family, even though she doesn't have kids. And, she's present with her sister and her sister's family and her nieces and nephews. And we tend to characterize the idea of family as being like mom, dad, 2.5 kids, whatever it's going to be. Nowadays, I think it's like 1.2 kids or less. But it's family, just because it's not your kids, or just because, maybe that relationship with them looks a little bit different than how we consider family to be. So it was a nice little reminder to see this come out in this cheesy film. And at the same time, I think it's really relatable that, especially as we head into the holidays, that if you're a person without children, it's easy to feel on the outs. It's easy to feel like, well, this isn't my family, in the sense that they're not your children. Or maybe you feel like a hanger-on, so to speak, with a sibling in their family, or you feel like the odd one out. Again, those feelings are valid, but this is if you're spending time with loved ones, and they don't even have to be blood relations, that can still be family. We can still cultivate family. So I said I was going to reference some podcast episodes that speak to this idea of alloparenting. Now, we don't talk about it using that term, but the idea of having children in your life and having family-like connections outside of having your own kids is one that comes up in my conversation in episode 32 with Jackie Shannon Hollis. Now, she has a large extended family, and we touch on that a little bit in the episode. But she also talks about some of the other connections that she has in her life with people who are not blood relations. And while I can't recall if we talk too much about kids that aren't those familial-like connections, we certainly talk about how broad her social circle is and how many connections she has, how much love she has outside of immediate blood relations. We also talk about having a role in young people's lives. So not specifically kids under 18 per se, but when I speak with Rena Esmail in episode 41 of the podcast, she is a composer who has chosen a creative child-free life, as you'll hear about in this episode. And she talks about just how much mentoring young people and playing a role outside of the parental role that these kids or young people have with their parents, and just how important that has been for the kids that she mentors or the young people that she mentors, as well as helpful for the parents to have somebody else who's sort of a cultivating important role in these kids' lives. Okay, the next theme or sort of discussion point that's been coming up in some of my coaching sessions, and this has been a big one we've also been talking about in one-on-one coaching, not just in the group program, but the idea that there are certain things in your life that you may need to make peace with and find some resolution with in order to really be able to come to a confident kids or child-free decision. And when I talk about making peace with a certain situation or experience, a circumstance, I want you to think about any part of your decision, the sort of circumstances surrounding it. It could be the kind of person you are. It could be something to do with something that's happened to you, something that you did in the past, but that you are resisting. And let me give you an example. So for me personally, we had some, I'll call them tensions in the household amongst us siblings, specifically one of my brothers. There was a really difficult dynamic there that I think, especially looking back in hindsight, really put me off the idea of having kids. It was many times very challenging for my parents with my brother. There was a lot of conflict between the two of us. And it gave me a different perspective on both parenting as well as sibling relationships than I think a lot of other people may have in their own families. And that is something for me that I've had to contend with and make peace with, because otherwise you carry this sort of resentment with you when you don't do that of well, if only I didn't have this sort of relationship with my sibling, if only it wasn't this way. Another example I'll give you is I, as I've shared, have struggled with anxiety, and I articulated it to my husband just a couple of weeks ago. It was both an aha moment as well as something that I'm pretty well aware of. But I said, I think a big part of the reason why I decided not to have kids is kids make me anxious. We were at a Christmas market and there was a kid running around and, just being a kid, screaming, jumping, chasing a friend. And I just could feel how anxious it was for me having this sort of noise, having this sort of boisterous presence. And it was a reminder that there's a lot about having kids that it just feels very anxiety provoking for me. And on the flip side of that, there isn't that much about having kids that, can act as a counterbalance to that, if you will, like something that's pulling me towards having children. My intellectual mind knows that there's a lot about having kids that is great, but from a nervous system sort of somatic felt sense, I feel having kids equals anxious. And this is something I also really struggled with, because for quite a time I used to beat myself up and think if only I wasn't so tightly wound, if only I wasn't so anxious, if only I felt differently around kids. But having and making some peace with feeling that way has really been a helpful way was a very helpful way for me to connect with the right decision for me. So I'm going to give you a few other broad examples in terms of maybe areas of your life, your decision that you need to make peace with. And how we do this, you might be thinking how do I make peace with this? I think a big part of that is feeling the feelings and the emotions associated with this. So, sitting with this sort of discomfort of wow, this is the person that I am at this point in my life. This is how I feel. Having compassion for ourselves. So for me, rather than judging myself, which I spent a long time doing, thinking, why are you this way? Why don't you feel different? Why aren't you more, maternal or whatever I thought I should be? Just finding it within myself, or having a curious attitude towards what if this is just how I am? Or what if this is just the way things are? That was a big part of me finding acceptance and making peace with myself and making peace with the way I felt. So again, just allowing ourselves to feel. Maybe this is about journaling. Maybe this is about writing a letter to your past self. You can be a little bit experimental with this and figure out, what aspect of your life or what circumstances need to be addressed. And again, journaling or, just sitting and feeling emotions, letting them come up, whether it's anger, whether it's sadness, whether there are tears that arrive. And just being with that. It's incredible how much we can be fearful of these tough emotions. And yet when we invite them in, we realize that they can't hurt us per se any more than the hurt we're already feeling. And that often they move through us, right? And then they kind of create a space to be Whew, okay, so things being as they are, where does that leave me? I said I would share a few other examples, and I took a bit of a detour there because I wanted to, just share a couple of suggestions in terms of how you can make peace with difficult feelings or circumstances. So it might be that you need to make peace with past dreams that you had, how you anticipated your life would look today. Maybe for you, that's about you thought you'd be with a partner, but actually you're single, or maybe you pictured yourself having a brood of children and now you find yourself leaning child free. Or maybe you just thought life would look entirely different and you've experienced loss or you've experienced heartache, or you're a different kind of person than you anticipated yourself to be. Those could all be ways in which you might need to be making peace with things. Some other things could be, it could be an aspect of your upbringing. So maybe there's resentment about or around the way you were raised or something that had happened to you, if there was some sort of traumatic event that happened. And so again, it's okay to feel the feelings. I'm not telling you, and I don't want to imply that making peace is like sweep it under the rug and just be done with it. No, on the contrary, this is about being totally connected with and okay with, which is something different than loving the way things are. And learning to find some sort of radical acceptance within yourself to say, like, again, having that curiosity of like, what if it's okay that this is the way things are? Like, how can I make peace with this? And if this is something you're struggling with, or if there's something really big that you're grappling with, I am a big proponent of therapy. I talk about this all the time, but there may be things related to this kids or child-free decision that are getting in your way that you need to clear through or find some peace with before you can actually make a feel-good decision. All right, I have some very exciting news to share with you, and that is off the back of some of your feedback, I have revamped our Confidently Child-Free group coaching program to create a month-long coaching intensive that is going to be kicking off starting January 9th. And this is for those among you who are pretty sure that you don't want to have kids. You are heavily leaning child-free. Some days you feel like you've made a total solidified decision not to have kids, and yet you keep waffling and wobbling. You might be spending time with your friends' kids and start thinking, oh gosh, am I really making the right choice? Or maybe you get comments from friends or strangers talking about the fact that you're going to regret your decision in the future, and you start to think that maybe they're right. In any case, you're not quite confident in your child-free decision, and it really is holding you back from moving forward confidently in your child-free life. If this sounds like you, I have an invitation to check out Confidently Child-Free, our group coaching intensive. Again, that's going to be kicking off on January 9th. We're going to run for a full month. And this program is going to help you get confident in your choice, to work through any of the lingering worries or concerns that you have, to be with like-minded women who get what it's like to choose that child-free path and yet to choose it sort of tentatively. If you don't relate to the messages and the fellow child-free women who you see out there on the internet who are saying, I've never wanted to have kids, I know it's definitely not for me, maybe they feel a little bit radical or an extreme in their perspectives. If you're somewhere still in that middle zone and you're not quite buying into this child-free path, this is a program you're definitely going to want to check out. I will include the details on our Confidently Child-Free group intensive in the show notes of today's episode, and you can also find them over at kidsorchildfree.com. So a couple of episodes you might tune into that I think speak really nicely to this idea of making peace with difficult circumstances or things that you may be resisting is episode 33 with Katie Bryan, who spoke about being a solo mother by choice. And she talked about a lot of the shame she carried and how much sort of resentment or sadness there was that she was even in this position of having to or feeling like she had to decide, do I want to do motherhood solo? Or am I going to wait and try and meet that right person? She talks about having been previously married and how when that marriage ended, she sort of found herself afloat feeling like, gosh, everything I'd planned for in my life now is something different. So again, even if you are not single, if you're not considering solo motherhood, I think it's a really good episode that addresses those emotions. Another great episode is episode 37, the one I had with Rachel Honeyman on when plans change. And Rachel had previously been very confident in a child-free decision. Her and her husband then decided that they did want to try to have children and unfortunately were unable to. And eventually she had to lay these dreams aside. And it's a very painful and difficult journey that Rachel walks in that season of her life. It continues to be difficult today, but I think this is a really great example of someone who's had to make peace with and find acceptance and navigate difficult emotions that come up through this kids or child-free decision. All right, speaking of difficult emotions, this has been, in general, a really big topic that we've been talking about. And specifically as we come towards the end of this cohort or this session we've been running with the Kids or Child-Free Group program. And what we talk about is that we need to allow in and feel all of the emotions around this decision. I think we have this idea that when we make the kids or child-free decision, it's only going to feel good all the time. And that is just false. It is a falsehood, because just like any aspect of life, any decision that you make is going to have difficulties at times. It will have challenges. There may be feelings of grief. There can be frustration. Like, think about the experience of raising a child, and as much joy and beauty as that may hold, of course it's going to be hard sometimes. Of course you may grieve the life you had before kids or the way things were. And likewise, just because you choose not to have kids doesn't mean you're necessarily going to just put to bed other desires that you may have had to, as we talked about in this example with alloparenting, perhaps really longing to have a certain connection with a child. Maybe there's an aspect of having or raising kids that was exciting to you, or that fit that sort of vision of the future that you'd had for yourself. Or perhaps your sadness is around the feeling that you're not going to be continuing on your family, in terms of like the legacy that you may have thought that you would leave behind, or continuing on the family name, family traditions, family rituals. Maybe there's sadness because that means that your parents aren't going to be grandparents. Okay. So there's lots of reasons to have difficult emotions. And one of the things we've been really working on is just sitting with the emotions that come up, allowing them to be, and not trying to make sense out of them or allowing them to necessarily influence the decision. We can of course take our emotions into account, but just because something feels hard or difficult or is causing you hurt does not necessarily mean it's the wrong decision. It might, okay? Sometimes our emotions and what we might characterize as bad or negative emotions could be telling us we're moving in the wrong direction. But as I've mentioned, any decision will potentially have some difficult emotions associated with us. And when we let those emotions come up, so quite literally not trying to repress them in our body, not trying to push them away, not trying to avoid feeling them, but just sitting. And you can practice with your eyes closed, just sitting and quiet. If you want, you can do this now, thinking about this decision, maybe one of the emotions that's present, whether it's anxiety or sadness, could be frustration. And just noticing it, where it's sitting in your body. Noticing, what thoughts might be connected with that. Just trying to locate it within you and just be present with it. All of those things can help you to realize that this emotion or emotions, they're not going to hurt you. It may feel hurtful again, but when we be with what is, it can make it so much easier for us to then connect with the right choice for us. A couple episodes on this topic of difficult emotions. One that I absolutely loved was my conversation in episode 40 with Becca Ray Tucker on abortion and the kids or child-free choice. And Becca in this episode, so first of all, we talk about the impact that a past abortion that she has had on her decision to be a mother today. And she now has one child, a daughter. But one of the topics that we touch on, and a term that Becca, as far as I can tell, she has coined this. We talk about it in the episode. She says, I think I made it up myself. I think she has coined this term, and I absolutely love it. And that is this idea of emotional agnosticism. And essentially that all emotions and feelings are equal. And what I just shared with you in talking about difficult emotions, that we can be with them and not necessarily say one is better than worse, but that they're actually all important. Becca and our conversation, I think, articulate this idea of emotional agnosticism perhaps a bit better than I have now. So again, check that out. That was in episode 40 of this season. And another conversation that is a must listen to is my conversation with Jennifer Flint, where we talk about the kids or child-free decision as a spiritual journey. And this conversation with Jennifer is just incredible because, first of all, we talk about how difficult it is to arrive at this decision oftentimes, and how it's really about us going deep within ourselves and asking tough questions to help connect us with the right decision. But we also talk about the grief that came after Jennifer made the decision to be child-free. And she talks about a moment arriving at a Buddhist retreat that she goes to, and how she realized that she had been called there to grieve motherhood and the motherhood that she would never experience. It's very powerful. I can highly recommend tuning in for that. Again, that's episode 45. Okay, the last sort of topic or theme I want to touch on that's been coming up in some of my sessions is about relationships. Now, I have all manner of questions that I address with my clients in the groups, in one-on-one coaching, when it comes to specifically when we're at odds with our partner around this decision. Either both of us are feeling ambivalent or unsure about what we want. Maybe one partner has clarity and certainty and the other doesn't. Regardless of what you're facing in your relationship, if your relationship is, and if you're partnered, it will be playing a role in this decision, imaginably. It should. We need to consider it. Is looking at the dynamics that are at play in your relationship outside of the kids or child-free decision and that need to be addressed. This has been something that's coming up quite a bit when I'm talking to people who are saying, you know, my partner really wants kids, I'm not sure, or I'm in this relationship and I'm trying to figure out what I want. And these are some of the things that are happening in my relationship. What I notice and what I often ask people is like, what else is going on in your relationship that, or let me say this again, a better way of framing it. When you look at what's happening with the kids or child-free decision and your partner, how is that sort of indicative of or representative of other things and other dynamics that are at play in your relationship? So, for example, you may realize that there are conflicting values happening with your partner. And it may be showing up, you know, just in terms of how you spend your time or what they enjoy doing versus you do. It could be certainly coming up in terms of that shared vision of parenthood. And I see a lot of reluctance from people to discuss this with their partner, or they just simply have overlooked it because they're so understandably immersed in trying to figure out what they want. But looking at how our partner feels about having kids, if they have different ideas than you in terms of how you raise them, you know, what parent or parents are staying at home, or, you know, daycare versus not, you know, the time spent, anything like small or large. Sometimes we see that there's actually conflicting values, or often we see there's conflicting values happening outside of this decision. So again, the two of you may not see eye to eye in terms of how household labor is being done. Or maybe you see eye to eye, but what's happening in practice is something different. Or perhaps the two of you, again, like you look at what their idea of a good time is when you think about your weekends, your holidays versus yours, and it could be totally different. Another dynamic that seems pretty common is imbalance in terms of the workload at home, both the physical labor that you're doing as well as the mental, emotional labor. And I am hearing specifically from a lot of you women who are in heterosexual partnerships that you feel like you are already taking on more of the load at home. And this is a point of tension with your partner. And oftentimes what you're hearing is that, yes, if we have kids, I will step up. Yes, I will, you know, partner or parent with you. Yes, I'm going to like take my share. And let me tell you, if things are not happening on the home front already to the degree that you'd like to see them, that should be giving you zero, or let's say that should be giving you a big indication that things will not be different if you have kids. Having a child or children puts an immense amount of pressure on a relationship. It has a tendency to have us fall back into sort of our default setting. And so if you are considering having kids with someone and what you're hearing is maybe different than what you're seeing, or you're finding that you're feeling a bit skeptical about promises that are being made, you need to find a way for your partner to show you that things are going to be different between the two of you before before actually them showing you how things are really going to be and having a child, right? There needs to be something that's addressed first. Another example could be, if you're having communication breakdowns over this decision, your partner doesn't really want to discuss it. They're deferring to you and saying, I don't know, whatever you think. It's bringing up conflict, or they're just flat out refusing to discuss it. I had somebody who had messaged me recently saying, like, my partner doesn't even want to engage in this topic with me. Again, that is really indicative of some of the things that could be or probably will be happening when you have a child or children, because communication is going to be one of those number one pillars for you to be able to parent and raise a child in a way that's going to feel supportive to the two of you and that's ultimately going to be beneficial to the child. So again, we want to try and work through some of these barriers or hurdles. And again, like, ask yourself, if you can imagine this decision as sort of a mirror, if this mirror is showing you something about your relationship, your romantic partnership, what is it showing you that needs to be addressed? Because my guess is, if there's a conflict between you and your partner around this decision, it's showing you that there's more going on than just a conflict around this decision. And so if we try and reach a clear decision with these barriers or hurdles or whatever these breakdowns or problems are happening in the relationship, if we try and make a decision with those in place, it is likely going to fester and lead to further issues. It could lead to resentment. It could negatively impact you, your child, the relationship. So it's really important that you look at addressing those sort of dynamics that are playing out in your relationship before making this decision, and certainly before having a child or children. I talked about therapy already in this episode. Couples counseling, highly recommend. I do also offer one-on-one, or I should say 1 to 2 coaching for couples. So if there are particular topics you're working through with your partner, please bear in mind, I'm not a licensed couples therapist. I'm not a licensed therapist either. Okay, I do coaching work, but I am happy to put on my coaching hat, so to speak, and help you work through some of these things that might be playing out. I'm also happy to recommend wonderful couples counselors in my network, and I can also suggest, checking out in your own network. Probably, you may be surprised to hear, but I know a lot of people in couples therapy, especially if you're on somewhere in your relationship, you've been with your partner 10 years, 15 years plus. You may be surprised to know that couples therapy is very commonplace. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It does not mean you have a bad relationship. It just means there's some things that you need some support addressing. So I can highly suggest this. And I know it's something that's also come up in past conversations. You need to address this before having children. The last thing I want to say on that is that if your partner doesn't want to change, doesn't want to address certain issues that are playing out, doesn't want to look at these dynamics, doesn't want to, visit or revisit communication breakdowns that you're having or imbalance in terms of shared workload at home, what makes you think that this would change in the future? And what makes you think that that is going to give rise to a great parenting relationship? I think you really need to ask yourself that. Okay, so a couple episodes I can point you towards from this last season would be episode 38 with Angela Accomando on surviving domestic abuse with kids. Now, this episode is a difficult one, and it takes to the extreme the sort of dynamics that we're talking about, not the implication that your particular relationship is abusive, although if you know or suspect it is, please, please, please listen to this episode with Angela. But it does show and highlight just how much the dynamics in a relationship can impact parenting and raising children and children themselves if they're allowed or able to fester. The other episode you're going to want to tune into is episode 42 with Astrid Hero-Delin on when you regret becoming a mom. This is the first conversation that I've had with someone about regretting motherhood. And one of the big things that comes out in the conversation is that Astrid talks about the dynamic between her and her partner, specifically concerning workload at home, mental load in particular. Now, she has found a lot of relief. Her and her partner both have really changed the dynamic through intensive couples therapy over these last several years of her son's life. But she does talk about how, not having those issues in place, or let's say having them in place, has given rise to certain difficulties for her in particular as the mother, that addressing them sooner would have been or is really helpful. At least this is sort of the summary, I would say, from our conversation that I took away from it, is that when we look at a division of labor and we look at mental load and we look at the involvement of raising a child, it's really important that a couple's on that same page, and that that workload and mental load specifically can be shared as much as possible. All right, that is all from this season 3 wrap-up episode. Again, would love to hear, did you like this format? Same. Maybe, I don't know, we can mix it up. You enjoyed the takeaways episode. I hope it was just as valuable, if not more so, for you to hear about some of the things we've been discussing in my group program, as well as one-on-one coaching. As always, if you're interested in working with me, yes, I offer coaching in both one-on-one and group formats, and you can find the information on my upcoming programs on my website, kidsorchildfree.com. I will also link to that in the show notes of today's episode. All right, well, you can look forward to some wonderful future conversations in the next season of the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. We have lots of fantastic stories coming your way, lots of topics we're going to be addressing. As I usually put the call out, I would love to hear from you in terms of who and what you would like to hear about on the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. If you've already submitted a request and you have not yet heard about this particular angle of the decision, this does not mean that I'm ignoring you or have forgotten you. It takes time to find the right people for these conversations. There's also so many different aspects of this decision to explore. So I promise we will get there. Today marks our 46th episode, and as of mid-January, we will have been 1 year of the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. So we've shared lots of fantastic stories and perspectives, but there are so many more to share. Now, I would actually love your help, because I am looking for particular stories to tell, and I'm going to put it out to you in case this either applies to you. I know we do have some parents listening. I know we have some definitively child-free people. And of course, I still always welcome people who are on the fence, who have something they want to share about how they're navigating this decision in light of particular aspects of this choice. So if you or someone you know fits the bill, reach out to me and we can talk about potentially having you on. I am looking for stories from people who have fostered a child or children. If you have been or are a foster parent, and how that sort of is intersected with your kids or child-free choice, I would love to hear from you. I am also looking to have someone on to share about being a transgendered parent and how you came to that decision, some of the unique hurdles that you may have navigated through that. Either if you are single, if you're partnered, would love to have you on as a couple. Again, looking for transgendered stories for Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Also looking for stepmom stories. So if you are a stepmother, I've received a few requests from people who are saying they're on the fence, and or perhaps they were affirmatively clear they wanted to either have or not have kids. And becoming a stepmom has thrown everything into question. So if you are either in this boat and you want to talk about your story, we could even potentially do a little bit of a sort of impromptu coaching podcast episode, I should say. Would be happy to walk you through some questions that you might want to explore on air. Or maybe you're somebody who has arrived at a clear decision after stepmotherhood. Drop me a message. 2 other stories I would love to tell and share. Loss of a parent, specifically if you lost your mother at what we can call a really formative age as a child, as a young woman. This could be a father as well. If this is played into your decision, I would love to hear from you. And I also would really love to tell a story about being a special needs parent, a child who is struggling with developmental challenges, who has physical, mental, emotional, special needs. If you have a story you want to tell on the podcast, I would love to hear from you. Okay, those are just a few examples. Those have been ones that have top of mind. I would really love to try and get all of those on in the upcoming season, if not at least tackle a couple of those. Thank you so much for listening. I cannot be more grateful for all of the growth we've seen with this podcast over the last year, almost year. I'm really thankful for every one of your reviews and ratings. A reminder, if you have not already rated or reviewed the Kids Are Child-Free podcast, this is the best way to help support the work that I'm doing and to help get this podcast discovered by new listeners. So you can go ahead and either, if you're in the Spotify app, you can leave a rating on there, or if you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a rating or review. Truly, if you have been putting this off, it would mean so much to me to have you go in right now, leave us a rating or review so we can end this season and this calendar year on a high. Thank you again for being here, for tuning in, and for all of your kind words. I'm really glad that this podcast has been the sort of supportive tool that I had hoped it would be. And I look forward to bringing you more conversations in season 4 of the podcast. We will be starting to air episodes as of January 8th. So you can look forward to those. All right, wishing you a wonderful holiday season with your loved ones. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks for tuning in for this latest episode of the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Now, before you go, I have a little something to share with you, and that is I want you to go check out the free resources page at kidsorechildfree.com because I have some goodies on there for you, guides you can download. I've got a recording of a class that you can check out, different tools, exercises, resources to help support you to make the kids or child-free decision that's right for you. I will link to that in today's show notes. And again, you can also find that at kidsorechildfree.com. That's all from me. I wish you a beautiful rest of your day, and I will see you back here very soon.